At the end of the last session, I introduced the pinnacle of Western scholasticism, the figure who would tower over Western Christianity and indeed, because of this, much of Western civilization of his day, and that figure was Thomas Aquinas. And honestly, the impact of Thomas Aquinas on the Western Church cannot be overstated. At the Council of Trent in 1545, which was called by the Pope to address the alleged errors of the Protestant Reformation, and which is considered by the Roman Catholic Church as the 19th Ecumenical Council, 3 sets of books were placed on the altar of the church where they gathered. One was the Bible. One was the papal decretals, that is, the letters of the Pope which formulated church law. And the final was the magnum opus of Thomas Aquinas, his Summa Theologiae. Let's just say that when you have your work placed on the altar of a church with the Bible and the infallible writings of the Pope, you know you've made it in theological circles. In a letter from 1879, Pope Leo XIII told all the churches of the Roman Catholic Church that Thomas Aquinas was the definitive exposition of Roman Catholic doctrine, and all clergy should base their teaching upon him. All seminaries and universities must teach Thomas Aquinas, and on anything that Thomas Aquinas didn't touch or give an opinion, the good and proper Roman Catholic response is to try and teach whatever would most line up with the rest of Aquinas' teachings. But who was Aquinas, and what were some of the key things he taught and gave to the church? Covering even a fraction of this would be impossible in such lectures, but today let's get a taste by considering his life, his writings, his arguments for the existence of God, and his use of analogy, which in many ways ties all of it together. Aquinas was born in 1225 in modern-day Italy to a very powerful and influential wealthy family. According to tradition, as the younger son, he was supposed to become a Benedictine monk, but he ended up going to university in Naples, and it was there that he was introduced to the teaching of Aristotle and a Dominican preacher, John of St. Julian. When Aquinas was 19, it was John of St. Julian who was influential on persuading him to not become a Benedictine, but instead to join the Dominican friars, also known as the Black Friars. You might recall from recent lectures and sessions that the Dominicans were founded by Dominic after his failure to convert the Cathar heretics of southern France, leading him to think that a stricter form of ascetic life with more generosity and more love was needed to share the gospel. For context, time-wise, the Dominicans were only founded 30 years or so prior to this point in Aquinas' life, so they were a very new and radical thing on the block. But becoming an itinerant friar with a new and upcoming radical group of friars was, without doubt, something which lacked the power and prestige of the abbey or the monastery, and it didn't therefore sit very well with Aquinas' parents. So to try and stop Aquinas from becoming a Dominican, his mother had his brothers kidnap him and hold him prisoner in the family castle. The brothers even hired a prostitute to try and seduce Aquinas, but this failed. Bear in mind that at this time the Pope generally had a whole harem of women, and monastics and priests and normal monasteries and abbeys were well known for their worldliness and love of sex, which is why the Dominicans and Dominic felt so compelled to create the Dominican order, which resisted these very worldly kind of things. Eventually, to save the family's face, Aquinas' mother told him to escape through the window and run away, because running away from house arrest was seen as saving more face than having your son willingly go and join the radical and crazy Dominicans, who don't want you to sleep with prostitutes and the like. Now, Aquinas would therefore run away and go to study in Paris, where he was known by his fellow students as the big dumb ox. Being dumb, though, was certainly not part of who he was, and one of his lecturers pointed out very clearly, that's wrong, he's going to go on to great things. And he would. He went on to teach in Cologne, and later he went back to Paris to teach there, and then teach in Naples and other parts of Italy, then Rome, then back to Paris, then Naples. But it was in Rome that he began to write his magnum opus, the Summa Theologiae, which I mentioned before. This was and is a mammoth work which was unfinished at the time of his death. But the English and Latin version, which you can buy in print, runs to 61 volumes. In the Summa, Aquinas looks at over 600 questions, which are broken down into over 3,000 different articles, each of which has numerous objections and counterstatements and arguments and individual replies to the statements and to the objections before coming to conclusions. That is the definition of scholasticism. It's scholasticism on steroids. And the Summa covers the deepest theology and the simplest questions of how to live your life and structure society. It looks at God and creation and humanity and salvation and Jesus. It looks at the sacraments. It spends a lot of time looking at ethics and the meaning and growing of virtue. It looks at concepts of law. It looks at true happiness. It really does cover a whole wealth of things. And it sums up the way in which, for Aquinas, human reason, a faculty given to us by God, is the way in which humans are supposed to find truth and what is knowable about God. God is the universal first cause of all things, and therefore everything goes back to God and is ordered and structured and governed by this first cause of all things that we call God. And as the universal first cause of everything that is, God is utterly other to creation and in essence unknowable to human created intellect. We simply lack the words and vocabulary to refer to and describe who and what God truly is. And because of this, all words and terms and ideas that we use and apply to God can only be used through analogy and metaphor. Now, those two things that I've just touched on are what we're going to explore a bit more of now. The idea of God as the universal first cause of all that exists, and the idea that you can only use analogy to speak of God. In question 2, right near the start of the Summa, Aquinas summarises 5 ways, sometimes called 5 logical proofs, but that's debatable, for the existence of God. And these are all, generally speaking, cosmological arguments, though one is more teleological. This means, as a cosmological argument, that they seek to infer or prove or argue for the existence of God from the observable cause and effect of the universe around us. And to be teleological means to look at the complexity of things and claim that that implies some kind of design or order of things that we see. Both of those are quite different to the ontological argument we looked at last time of Anselm, which uses ontology, the idea of the existence of reality itself, to prove God. Aquinas actually didn't really like Anselm's ontological style of argument for God. It was too grounded in Plato rather than Aristotle. Though Aquinas didn't completely disregard Plato, and much of his ideas around God being unknowable in his essence and the need for analogical speech derive more from Plato than they do from Aristotle. It's almost like he was grasping at whatever philosophy he could find to argue his points. So what were the 5 ways that Aquinas gives to look at the evidence for God? Let's consider them in turn. The first way. When we look around us, we see that things change. To be changed, something must cause you to change. Whatever changes something has also at some point itself been changed, which means something must have changed it, and so on, and so on, and so on. But this change, this chain of things being changed by things that are themselves changed by things that are themselves changed, cannot logically be infinitely long. There must be at the very start of the chain of change an unchanged, unchangeable changer, an unmoved mover. This is what we understand to be God. The second way. When we look around, we can see that things are caused, but nothing can be the cause of itself. And that would mean it existed before it existed, and that's a contradiction. To cause yourself is to exist before you exist. That's not possible, surely. If something is caused, it must have a cause, which itself must have a cause, which itself must have a cause, and so on, and so on, and so on. But that chain of cause cannot be infinitely long. So there must be a cause which is not itself caused. This is what we understand to be God. The third way. When we look around, we see that things that are possible to be are also possible not to be. That is to say, things that exist can then cease to exist through death or decay or erosion or explosions, whatever. But if everything were capable of going out of existence, nothing would end up existing even now. There must be something which is fundamentally necessary, which must exist and cannot not exist. This is what we understand to be God. The fourth way. When we look around, we see that there are various degrees of things. A healthy animal is better than a sick animal. To be alive is better than to be inanimate. A perfectly drawn circle is better than a poorly drawn circle. To be able to judge that some things are better than others requires a standard against which things can be judged. When we say that a person or thing is good, this requires a standard which is by necessity the ultimate, the most good thing. The most good being, the most good thing, is what we understand to be God. And finally, the fifth way. When we look around, we see that things that lack intelligence in the world act in regular and predictable ways. Apples fall directly down from trees, for example. This is not down to chance, because it happens every single time, and it implies that their behaviour, dropping down, must be set by something that cannot in themselves lack intelligence to choose. They must be able to cause other things to act in certain ways. Apples lack the intelligence and capability to not choose to fall straight down. A human, on the other hand, with intelligence, we could choose to jump forward before we fall down. Therefore, the behaviour of non-intelligent things, of inanimate things, must be set by something else which is intelligent. This ultimate cause of order and direction in the universe is what we understand to be God. What you may notice about these 5 different ways is that they don't actually tell you much about God at all, who he is and that kind of thing, only that he is the thing which is not caused. God is the thing that does not change. God is the thing that cannot cease to exist. God is the thing which has the standard by which language uses things to be judged. God is the thing that orders non-intelligent things. But that shouldn't be surprising given what I've already said about Aquinas, that he doesn't think that we can actually know God in that kind of way, that we can only know what he is not. And that is why when we speak of God and when we read of God, we can only do so through analogy. So what does this mean? What is Aquinas talking about with analogy? Well, let's think about what you might call the horizontal analogy first. Have you ever noticed that we use the same word to describe different things in different ways? And this happens in all languages, though the words and how they're used and what for does differ. You might describe a knot in a piece of rope as very tight. Or you might say a Yorkshireman with his finances is very tight. Or you might say the friendship between 2 close brothers is tight. Now, saying that my brother and I are tight does not imply that we are literally entwined around each other in such a way that we couldn't be closer and it's difficult to physically pull us apart, like a knot would be tight. We're using an analogy. Here's another, a broader example, very applicable here. Have you ever really thought about the term good? We might say that a dress has good quality based on the fabric that it has, and that Sunday attendance in a village church of 100 people is good in terms of quantity. But quality and quantity are both different things. And they're different from saying that 7:30 p.m. is a good time to have a discussion online, which is different than saying that a party which you went to was a good time, in part because it met in a good place. These are all quite different as well to saying that someone is a good person in a moral sense, which is itself entirely different from saying that a picture of that person someone painted is a good representation of them, which has nothing to do with the morals that they have as a good person. All of these are using that term good in a horizontal way. They're describing created things here on earth, down below. But what if we look vertically instead of horizontally and we start to think about God? In what sense is God good? Well, it's not in quality or quantity. It kind of is in morality, but not really in the same way you might say that Joe Bloggs is a good person. And it's not that he's a good time in the way that a party is, or that he's in a good place in the sense of a shopping precinct in the centre of town. Surely actually what is happening here is that God is the ultimate good. He's the source of all goodness. And the way in which he is good is so beyond the things here below. But the things here below are things that we call good because they actually reflect and flow out from their cause and their creator, the ultimate good that is God. Things horizontally here below, they're good in some way because they reflect the goodness of God. Likewise, when we speak of truth or unity or being or existence, these are all things that reflect something of God, who is the ultimate truth and the ultimate unity and the ultimate existence or being, because he's the cause of all being and existence, he's the cause of all truth, and he's the cause of everything that unifies the universe. So when we talk about God, according to Aquinas, someone who we cannot possibly truly know because of how utterly other and different and above us he is, we have to use this language of analogy and recognise its limits. We know the good and truth and unity and being and honour exist because we see it here below. And whatever those things are in God, the cause of them, he must be those things to an infinite degree, such that he is those things in a fundamentally different way from the things here below. God is truth in a fundamentally different way than the principles of mathematics. He's good in a fundamentally different way to the way things are good here below. The unity and oneness of God is fundamentally different to the unity of things here below. And this has an impact on how we understand the Bible and what it reveals about God, because it says that we must fundamentally use human language to reach for the truth of God and who he is. Often the language of the Bible is what we call anthropomorphic, that is, it speaks of God as if he were a human. But God in the Bible says, I am not a man that I would change. God isn't human. He doesn't think like humans. He doesn't feel like humans. He doesn't act or change like humans do. And this must always be held in mind when we speak of God and think of God and read the Bible. And it's one of the reasons why Aquinas, along with other scholastics, hold that reason is needed to know what we can know about God. But in Aquinas' own words, in a hymn that he wrote, faith, our outward sense befriending, makes our inward vision clear. When it really comes to knowing God, faith is the one that has to join with reason.